This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I'm excited about today's episode, as I'm finally getting the opportunity to discuss the topic I am most interested in, and that is humanism, or what I call secular grace. It is ultimately about answering the question, how do we live life well post-deconversion? Rather than looking backward, it is looking forward to learning to thrive as a human being. Today's guest is Jim Palmer. Jim is an ordained minister, receiving his Master of Divinity degree from Trinity Divinity School in Chicago. After serving several years as the senior pastor of a non-denominational church, Jim left professional ministerial life on a quest for more authentic spirituality, and he has authored 5 books about this journey. In addition to writing, speaking, and his spiritual direction practice, Jim is an adjunct professor in the areas of ethics and comparative religion. He's the co-founder of the Nashville Humanist Association and is a certified Humanist Chaplain with the American Humanist Association. Jim's first 5 books chronicle his deconstruction and a search for an authentic spirituality. As I mentioned in the show, Jim is a humanist who has written an awful lot about Jesus. He's currently completing his 6th book, which will have a more secular humanist perspective. I'll have links in the show notes for Jim's online presence and his books. Jim has a way with words. Let me give you a couple of quotes from his perspective. Quote, "Many people tend to equate morality, ethics, spirituality, goodness with religion or a belief in God, while a humanist sees these as innate and inherent human characteristics and interests." End quote. Quote, "Whereas atheism is more of a position, disbelief in the existence of God or gods, humanism is more of a practice, living a meaningful, ethical, responsible, altruistic, spiritual life." My conversation with Jim is wide-ranging and seems to cover a number of different topics. I have a plan going into these interviews, but I like to have the conversation unfold naturally, and that takes place here, as Jim and I think, really make a connection with one another. My only disappointment is that we did not have more time to get into the history and philosophy of humanism. Maybe Jim will be willing to come back a second time. A couple of notes. Jim's mic was clipping a little bit. I haven't been able to completely fix that, so I apologize for the audio quality. And lastly, you might hear my dog Jasmine in the background bark at one point. And ironically, that turned out to be Jehovah's Witnesses at my door. So irony wins the day. And with that, I give you Jim Palmer. Jim Palmer, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Hey, David. I'm really looking forward to our chat today.
Yeah, fantastic. I've spent the last few days kind of going through your blog, and I think you have a really, really fascinating story, and I'd like to get into that. And in fact, the podcast is often about the people that are experiencing doubt or deconstructing their faith or deconverting entirely. And so the focus I like to focus on is faith transitions. And oh boy, does it sound like you went through a few of those. So I'd like to start with, can you just tell us about where you came from religiously, spiritually, and where you are now and how you got to where you are now?
Okay, well, rewind the story of my life to freshman in college after growing up in a really traumatic, difficult, volatile childhood and youth. I went off to college, and in college, in the student union center one day, I happened to run into a guy who was the campus director of Campus Crusade for Christ. And I was not a particularly religious person. I grew up loosely Catholic. My mother was an alcoholic. My father left our family when I was young. But every now and then I went to Catholic Mass until I had a choice not to go and then quit, because I just never saw really the relevance of God and church for my life. But I went off to college. I met this individual, the Campus Crusade for Christ director. We became friends, and I made the decision to become a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I saw it as a possible way of finding meaning and purpose in my life, maybe healing from some of the chaos of my early childhood, and got very involved in that organization. And that's kind of where it all started. I became the student president of our campus ministry. I went overseas and did summer projects with Campus Crusade for Christ. I almost went on staff with the organization after graduating from college, but a gentleman moved into our college town and started a church, and I got involved in that. And the pastor, the guy who started the church, encouraged me to go to seminary. I went to seminary, moved to Chicago, got an MDiv at Trinity Divinity School. While I was at, won preaching awards, and I discovered along the way that I had some speaking and leadership gifts. And so I got all this affirmation to continue down this track. So I graduated from seminary, and actually before I actually graduated, I accepted a position as a pastor on what at the time was the largest Christian church in North America. It was in the suburbs of Chicago, and that's where I got my hands-on ministerial training, and then eventually left my position there to start and lead a non-denominational Christian church in the Nashville area, which I did for several years until I had my own crisis of faith.
Right. I like that word, crisis of faith.
The faith, yes.
That rings a bell, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
The crisis of faith for me had to do with the cognitive dissonance that resulted from week after week, month after month, year after year, teaching and preaching outstanding, bulletproof evangelical theology, and yet noticing that the problems of people's lives persisted: unhappiness, depression, broken relationships, and other kinds of wounds in people's lives going unhealed, and a lot of brokenness and hurt and suffering. And
some of it caused by the church, even.
Right. Well, later, for sure, it took me a while to realize that I was complicit in some of that suffering, or at least the inability to deal with it effectively. So I then took a look at step back and looked at my own life, and it was also true of my own personal life. Despite all that good theology and upstanding biblical teaching, there was brokenness, lack of peace and joy, and inner suffering in my own life. So,
right.
To kind of make an already long story shorter, I decided at that point that I wanted to leave my ministerial career and try to figure out what, if any of this, I still truly believed and wanted to hold on in my life. And so I resigned my position in the church, and at that point made a break with my Christian background, my Christian tradition.
Okay.
That's when I started writing. I started blogging a little bit about my journey out of religion, and a publishing house contacted me, an editor at a publishing house had been reading my blog and said, have you ever thought about maybe writing a little bit of your story about leaving ministry and faith and what you discovered and so on and so forth. And then that's kind of what got it started in terms of me writing a little bit more about my journey.
Okay. Do you think that that there are more of us who were in ministry who have since found that it lacking in some way or another? It seems to me like you just can't shake a stick without bumping into people who were, pastors or preachers or missionaries or what have you. Is there something special about that? Is there something special about getting an MDiv like yourself that leads to deciding that it's maybe not all true?
Well, after I wrote the first book, Divine Nobodies, I was really, one of the biggest surprises were how many people contacted me who were actually still in ministry, could identify with my own misgivings with what was happening within the church and my role in it and so on. And a lot of those people would say, Jim, I'm with you, but if I said any of this stuff in my actual church, I would be fired, I would be let go of. And then later, I ended up speaking at an event and became a member of something called the Clergy Project. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Yes, and in fact, that has come up on the show a few times. I very much am a distant supporter of it. I've never felt quite like I, meet all the criteria to get in. I was youth pastor for like 2 years, very briefly.
Yeah.
and moved on, and then deconverted, like 20 years later. So it just, although I very much feel sympathetic, and I think they do great work. So yeah, tell us
Yeah.
please tell us about it.
Well, the Clergy Project is basically an online community, a private online community for people who are currently in ministry. They hold a professional ministerial position, but have come to the point where they no longer hold on to the beliefs that they are responsible to represent as a clergyman in their church or their denomination or their religious community, and the challenges and struggles of when that happens and the transition out and things like that. And I do a lot of individual work, a lot of spiritual direction and personal development coaching and so on with people who have been in ministry and left, and then they kind of had to start over with what they want to do in life. There's a lot of people out there with MDivs.
Exactly.
And, okay, now what?
Yes.
Yeah. But to answer your specific question about, I don't know, I think that it seems to me that a person with an MDiv, they've constructed a theological belief system that works for them and what they're wanting to do with it in life and in their career. But I think that what I've seen is, as they continue on in life and they start to experience their own suffering, maybe they go through a divorce, maybe they have a tragic loss, and so everything that sounded right when they were in seminary and seemed right when they were teaching it as a pastor or a church leader, the reality of life sometimes then can be what disrupts their confidence in the answers that they were given. And in most seminaries, theology isn't exactly generally an open-minded pursuit of truth, right? It's at least theology is usually has to do more with developing your basis and your defense of an already determined position that you have, and when life starts poking holes in that that belief system, and one of the things I did after ministry was I did some human rights work and traveled the world working cases of forced child prostitution and child slave labor, and those experiences definitely challenged a lot of my deeper theological beliefs about God, the existence of God, and a whole slew of doctrines related to the existence of God.
Yeah. I don't know about your experience, but if you travel, especially, and you meet people from different cultures with different religious cultural backgrounds, the doctrine, the idea of this is the one and only way is maybe the first thing that goes away, that you lose, right? You see, it seems to me that many of us on this side of faith have, took on universalism as a kind of a stepping stone before we maybe had a final faith transition. Was that the case for you?
Well, I think you're right that whatever religious tradition a person has, generally they're kind of born into it. It's not rocket science that if you're born in Tennessee, the likelihood of you being a nominal or cultural Christian is very high. If you're born in India, you're born in the Middle East, so it's not like we choose for we kind of almost, our culture determines for the most part our initial belief system. And so I think for myself, I went through a phase, for lack of better, the interfaith phase.
Yeah.
And
ecumenical. Yeah.
Yeah. And I did a lot of interfaith work in the city. I have a friend who's an imam at the Islamic Center in Nashville. I kind of reached across a lot of different religious traditions, friends with some of the leaders at the Baha'i Temple here in Nashville. So I've spoken at times at the Universalist, the Unitarian Universalist Church here in our city. I know the woman who's the head minister there. She's a very sharp individual, and so I went through some involvement in that respect, the interfaith, but I didn't really stay there. But there's a lot of positive things that could be said for people who take more of an interfaith approach to religion in the world, right? I mean, we can all be divided and hate each other and kill each other because we're represent different religious traditions, or we can try to identify the common denominators that we all agree on and try to create a world where we can coexist with peace, harmony, and some constructive relationship, you know?
Right. And today, would you refer to yourself as a humanist?
I would. I think that what compels me about the idea of humanism is that it identifies both the solutions, the problems and the solutions that we experience in our world as human ones. And on the merits of being a human being with the skills, tools, capacities, and abilities that we have, that we're capable of creating a world that works for everyone, and it doesn't necessitate any belief in God or divine intervention or supernatural means by which to achieve that, you know. And that's one of the things that I really see a lot with the damaging impact that religion has sometimes had in people's lives, is that there's a tremendous diminishment of a human being's natural skills and tools and abilities to live an ethical, meaningful, fulfilling, compassionate, productive life, you know?
Yeah.
And
I think you just recently tweeted and I'm probably I'll have you quote it, but we are humans having a human experience, not spiritual beings having a human experience, right? Talk to me about that. What does that mean to you?
Well, there's these things that are these phrases and axioms and so on that are so common. And one of them is that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. And I think part of the idea is that the extraordinary part of that really is that we're a spiritual being. Like that's really the most important thing. And, we happen to be having a human experience. And even if you reverse it around and say, well, I'm a human being having a spiritual experience, I guess my point is that why have we even delineated humanness and spirituality as some two, separate and exclusive categories? So, what about I'm just a human being having a human experience, and the human experience includes things like the experience of love, the expression of compassion, the living a life of meaning, being a person of virtue, experiencing the awe and wonder of a remarkable universe, feeling yourself connected to all of life in a deeply rich way. Why that's what it means to be a human being. So I don't think we need the added piece of either the supernatural. I mean, I get that usually the general definition of spiritual is that it's the non-material. So, and I get that, but I think that sometimes the impact of religion here has too deeply divided the sacred and the secular.
Mhm.
and divided up the world in this way. The spiritual stuff, the sacred spiritual stuff is you go to church, you read scriptures, you participate in religious practices, and that this is really the spiritual and sacred stuff. And the secular things are like everything else.
Right, right. Yeah. So, so again, one of the other reasons for the podcast is for me to get some education and become a little less ignorant. And I think you've been doing this a while. You've got a lot of experience, you've written several books. One of the hardest things for me post deconversion, which happened around 2015 for me, is just the language. So, I think that it's a human need for, let's say, quote unquote, spirituality. But that word spirituality is so misleading, right? And the words like soul and now I can't think, but these ideas that that religion has tried to own for so long, and then we find ourselves with a more naturalistic perspective, let's say. So how do you are you comfortable using those words? Do you redefine them some way? How do you handle that?
I think that you're right, that language is a real challenge when it comes to religion, spirituality, anything that's somewhat abstract.
Mm-hmm.
Because basically human language is a social technology that we created in order to cooperate and function effectively together as a species.
Yeah.
So it works really well if I refer to this thing I'm holding in my hand right now as a coffee cup, because I can say that this is a cup, and roughly anybody that hears that word, although they're going to envision a different kind of cup, we basically know what we're talking about. Right. A cup or a chair or a table. But when you start using language to describe more abstract things is when it really becomes a bit problematic. I mean, just take the word God.
Exactly. Yeah.
Basically, there's one way you could look at it, which is to say, basically, God is a word. God is a word. It is a linguistic marker that we all agreed was going to indicate an ultimate reality that is beyond comprehension and understanding. And we're going to use the word God to refer to that thing that that falls into that category. And the problem is, to some extent, is that even though so we say that the word God is a marker in language to refer to an ultimate reality we can't really comprehend, but then people run in and they start defining what it is. In a way that doesn't make sense. You can ask any person, really any religious person, tell me about God. And one of the first things you're going to say, well, God is infinite. He's unfathomable. The human mind can't comprehend the magnitude of God. The highest mind cannot. And yet, then we run out and we create a theology and doctrine and creeds defining exactly what God is, So that's why I'm not particularly fond of the word God, and I'm not really fond of most spiritual religious language, because I've just learned that people already got a predetermined definition and an understanding. So what makes it more difficult is that I try to be more descriptive of the thing I'm trying to talk about without slapping like these religious words on it.
Right.
And
I think the term God is the most dangerous term in existence, right? Because almost literally every single person, as they hear that word, has a different conception, even within the same faith tradition, of what it actually means. And so it's the most misleading term that we can use.
It is. The other terms we try to plug into it aren't all that great in the end either, because even if we decide we're going to call God universe or source or all these things we come up with, I think that the mind can't be tricked. It still knows you're talking about, it's whatever one word we find to plug into, it's not perfect, because it's hard to get away from the conception that this thing that we're referring to is something that is transcendently separate and different from what I am.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever we refer to try to refer to something that's describing a transcendent reality, the words kind of evoke this idea of separation. I mean, because if I call something source, like, then it's the source. And unless I'm going to call myself the source, if I'm calling the ultimate reality thing the source, then it's still somehow different or separated from who I am.
Okay. And so do you have, so I hear you that you don't use that term, but do you have I just want to be clear where we're at. Like,
Okay.
Do you have a conception of God that you do accept, like an idea, like you throw in the term source around? Is there something that you do identify as external to yourself in some way?
Well, with respect to God, if you run through all the options, okay, number one, theism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's one option, which I don't subscribe to. There's other options like deism, pantheism, panentheism. I mean, there's a lot of different, God is everything, or God is in everything, or God, it kind of just becomes over the spectrum of definitions or conceptions about God. There are a whole lot of different options
Mm-hmm.
that one can choose from. I'm not really a fan of deism either, because it's basically, okay, there is a God, and that God is the first cause, and then he kind of stepped away, and whatever happens, happens, kind of thing.
Right.
So I think that the reason why I was compelled by humanism is a humanist perspective doesn't really need or require any, a definition or an interpretation to somehow squeeze something like a God into the picture.
Right.
Like the humanism approach is that the meaning and the fullness of life doesn't necessitate the supernatural, the divine, or a belief in God. Okay, so that's why I don't. Okay, now, but that's a little different from saying, if you were to ask, okay, and I think William James has a very loose definition of religion in one spot, talking about that, to kind of paraphrase, there is a non-material transcendent reality or mystery that seems to be at the heart of things. And I don't know what it is or what to call it, but I find that when I align myself with that thing, that I find, harmony and well-being. Okay. So then the question would be, well, what thing are you talking about exactly? Well, this comes back to, I think, the perspective of humanism, which is that why can't that thing be your ability to make your own meaning in life? Why isn't that thing the embracing and practice of virtue? Why isn't that thing the ability to appreciate the non-material aspects of life: love, beauty, well-being, peace, compassion, solidarity?
Right.
These are all non-material. Abraham Maslow talked about that self-actualization was on the top of his hierarchy of needs, and he talked about peak moments and peak human experiences and the full actualization of your human possibilities and potentialities. I view all this as being an aspect of the human journey, the human experience.
Exactly. I think that religion and Christianity in particular has a kind of a negative view. If you're a Calvinist, it's the total depravity concept, but a negative view of humanity. And so when we come out of religion, sometimes I think we carry that with us. And one of the things I personally appreciate about humanism is saying that this human experience, my connecting with you right now, this conversation that we're having, and we're recognizing in one another similar experiences and recognizing the humanity in one another, that is a profound, deep, and meaningful experience. That's the human experience. And that my love for my family, my love for my friends, that the awe that I feel when I go hiking in the woods, all of those things are a part of nature and ourselves as human beings, and that we don't need to make reference outside of that. So that's the way I think. So.
Yeah, I think that you really put your finger on something that too often religion ends up disparaging the inherent value and worth of the human being. So there's a doctrine of original sin, right? That you're actually born into this world as someone with a sin nature. Okay, so that's strike one. Then you have people that there's all kinds of biblical verses that can be used to perpetuate a view of the weakness and the frailty of the human being. I mean, how many times have I heard the I am weak and he is strong? That I'm not really capable within myself to guide and lead my life forward in meaningful, ethical, fulfilling ways. This is where God comes in, or the misused verse about how the heart is wickedly deceitful is a verse that's all. So I do see a lot of people who come out of religion who are very underdeveloped. They've not developed the human tools that are available to them that they naturally have to create a life of meaning and purpose and fulfillment, and they have all kinds of self-sabotorial thoughts. And so a lot of times I will, in some of the work I do with people, I mean, religion stirs people up on how they need to have a good relationship with God. I think in your transitioning out of religion, the focus becomes how to cultivate a meaningful relationship with yourself.
Okay.
Self-confidence, self-reliance, self-awareness, self-acceptance, self-love. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you have to pretty much start over in terms of how you relate to yourself, self-trust. So I see that a lot, when people are kind of going through that phase. Otherwise, because you can easily switch your dependency on one thing to another, without ever learning what's available to you purely as a human being.
Right. So we've touched on it briefly here, but you kind of do coaching for people that maybe have come out of religion with some religious trauma, let's say. Would you describe that? Like, what are some of the key things that you often have to talk people through?
There's definitely a spectrum. I do spiritual counseling with people who have been damaged or traumatized through their experience in religion, and there's a range of that. The clinical term RTS, or religious trauma syndrome, is the phrase that's being used more and more in clinical terms in terms of addressing people that have been psychologically and emotionally and spiritually damaged through their involvement, in religion. And I think that there is, of course, there's toxic religious indoctrination. And we've talked about that a little bit already. The way a very shame and fear-based approach to life is sometimes the way religion derails a human being. And it's very difficult to get past that. Like a lot of people that have kind of left their religious involvements, they still carry that fear. Well, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm the wrong one?
Right.
And so the shame and fear are two of the most damaging things that happen in people's lives who had that kind of religious experience. Shame being that there is something incurably wrong with me, and fear is that I always need to be afraid of what could happen.
Right.
And so, but when a person changes their when they leave their religious beliefs and they start deconstructing and they leave church, it destabilizes everything, for a lot of people. First, it destabilizes your identity, right? Because a lot of a person's identity often is based on their religious belief system. Their social network was revolved around their religious subculture, their religious belief system. Their closest relationship, marriage, friendships, revolved around their religious belief system. All their answers to the big important existential questions: why am I here? Where am I going? What happens when I die? All that had nice answers attached to that. So once you start selling away from that, then it's all destabilized. So it could be it can be volatile.
Right.
Marriages. What do I do with my kids now? The existential dread. And all of that kind of gets loneliness for people who don't know who to talk to, and so it's something that is very volatile and difficult to work through, but you can, and there's steps to doing it, and you don't have to do it by yourself, and it's not going to all happen at once, but it happens every day. People work through it.
Yeah. Man, yeah, I totally recognize a lot of the things you just described, but the just lost what you felt was your best friend, your closest confidant. This internal thing that was gave you an entire sense of being and purpose and comfort. And all of a sudden, you no longer think that is something external. And at the same time, if you talk about this fact, you're going to lose, the community around you, possibly even friends and family, depending on how bad things are. So yeah, I think, go ahead.
Well, and it just takes a while. I mean, eventually you realize that there actually are a lot of people that are right where you're at, who can appreciate and accept you where you're at. The whole world isn't your previous Christian or religious subculture, but it takes a while to start establishing new connections with other people. Like, for example, a lot of times when people are in this phase, I might encourage them to look and see what meetup groups are in your city.
Yeah. Yes.
Because a meetup group, there's secular, humanist, atheist, agnostic, non-spirit. There are a lot of groups that you can check out to start maybe getting connected with people who are fine with where you're at. They're not going to have a problem with what you believe or don't believe about God. The other thing too, though, is that I think that we are a little bit perhaps a victim of Western civilization, who is insistent upon working everything out conceptually in our mind. So a lot of people will go through this incessant, I need a new and improved version of God. I need a new and improved version of this. And they just roll it over in their mind. And they're like, the mind is a concept generating machine. And, I remember, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Forrest Gump, but there's that scene where he's run and run and run. And then finally he just gets to this point where he's like, okay, I'm done.
I'm done running. So I just want to bring up, I read your blog. It sounds like you're a runner. I'm a runner as well. I find so much of, I don't know, just quiet time when I'm running, and I feel so much better after I do that. And so every time I see Forrest Gump and he says, I just felt like running, I start weeping, because that means something so deep to me, and the grief that he was experiencing, and that running gave him some peace for that. And
go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah, and there are times when, I mean, for me, so basically I use that analogy to say I came to a time where I was like conceptualizing, working over my mind. What's the new belief? What's the new thing to plug in? And then finally it was just like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I'm tired
Yeah.
of this constant, like, and is it necessary? Like, how much of this, is this helping me love people more? Is this connecting me into the present moment? Is this allowing me to enjoy the world that I live in? Is this actually improving and bettering my life? Like, who says I have to figure it out and come up with a nice, detailed belief system about something, And I wrote about this in one of my books. Okay, like if I go enjoy the sunset, is the experience of the sunset going to be heightened if I can explain it, or if I can develop a sunsetiology about it? It's not. In fact, it's probably going to. But yeah, so I think that outside of religion, I found a lot of fulfillment in very human things. One of them was running. I started marathons, did ultra marathons. The longest one I've run is 135 miles. And I started in art. I realized that I really enjoyed abstract art, and enjoyed being outside in nature and all. And so I know that for a lot of people, because religion determined what they could or couldn't do, what they should or shouldn't like, they don't even, like when in my Life After Religion course, one of the modules, I give the person a whole list of questions to help them determine, what spirituality means for them. But the questions like, what brings you joy? What centers you in yourself? What makes you come alive? And a whole slew of questions that are just, designed, they're simple and practical questions, not these big theological or existential ones. It's the same thing with the meaning of life, where, if I were to say that life is meaningless, some people would get a bit upset and think that that's really dark and it's hopeless and it's nihilistic and all this stuff. But the other way to look at that is that's really entirely hopeful and inspiring, because what it means is that you have the freedom to cultivate the meaning that matters to you. You can determine what matters most to you in life, and then you can cultivate a life that reflects that. There's not like someone telling you it has to be this. So saying that there's life is meaningless is not saying that there's no meaning. It's just saying that you're the one who has the opportunity to create, determine, and cultivate it, as opposed to religion telling you what it's supposed to be.
Right. I like to say that the universe may be indifferent, but humanity is not. Right. We are the meaning makers. We make meaning.
So. Yes, and so I think that it takes time to make that transition out of religion. I think sometimes it's more practical, daily, simple things, and less, this kind of gnashing of the brain to come up with better answers to the existential questions of our origin and what happens when you die. And, I just read a book by Becker called The Denial of Death, Ernest Becker. And one of the things he says in his book is that whereas Freud saw sexuality as sort of the fundamental problem that leads to so much neuroses, Becker says, no, it's really the terror of death and what that represents. The finality of it, the becoming, facing the creatureliness of our existence as human beings. And so I think that one of the reasons why people are very attached to religion is, for example, religion supplies answers to the things that people are most fearful of, or the things that they want to build their security around.
Yeah. I've noticed lately, and I want to do an episode on grief. I plan on doing an episode on grief. But even just our cultural touchstones, if you look at Netflix and just count the number of movies that are about seeing a loved one after death in some way or another, right? Somehow transcending that barrier of death. It's so much, I feel like so much of religion is the psychological defenses, a natural, normal human response to losing someone that you love so dearly that you can't fathom not having them with you.
Yes, I think that what I see, though, that sometimes there are ways that religion can let a person off the hook from embracing life fully.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if the downside of having this sort of certainty of an afterlife, it's kind of like the backup plan. Whatever happens in this life, it's, you know, I mean, how many Christian people have you heard say that, well, you know, even the Bible verse about how your struggles now are minuscule compared to the reward in heaven and this kind of thing.
Right.
You know, so who was it? Was it Marx that said that religion is the opium of the people? The basic idea was that the proletariat or the working man could experience unjust conditions in the world, and they would be tolerant of it because on Sunday morning the preacher would woo them into these dreams of a future heaven, and there was a passivity that would kind of set in, you know, like why confront my conditions now when I can expect to have a reward in the future if I will just tolerate these a little further. It's the same thing with apocalyptical kind of teaching. You know, if I believe basically it's all going to go up in flames, then like what do I really need to be all that worried about the earth or the
climate change? Yeah, who cares?
Right, right. It's all going to, you know, go through a nuclear meltdown in the end and start over.
Right. Yeah, no, I think eschatology it has really dangerous, especially we're now seeing this in the United States political system, just the kind of policy that gets generated based on some eschatological theology is terrible. So,
yes.
Yeah. Hey, I do want to circle back just a little bit. So again, I think people that have gone through these faith transitions, first thing they do is they get online and they see just these terrible, angry people yelling at each other. Yeah. So, so 2015, I realized, I no longer believe. I don't believe. What do I do now? Right. And so, I started reading books, I started getting online, and really what I was looking for was community. But the first thing you see is everyone else going through the same kind of grief, anger phase that we all kind of go through. It's a real natural part to kind of lash out at our former faith. But what can we do as humanists to try to step into that gap, right? So that the baby not a theist, or however you want to describe them, but the early phases of that deconstruction, deconversion, that they can find a more positive community that's not just in that angry phase.
Yeah, I remember that I wrote a blog post. It's a long time ago, but I repost it every now and then, which was something like the 5 mistakes I made in my deconstruction of religion. But I introduced it by saying that mistake is probably the wrong word, because a lot of this is just going to happen. It's even a necessary part of the process, but you have to also, it's something, there's more on the other side of it, as opposed to getting stuck in it. And one of the mistakes that I made is that I shifted one fundamentalism to another, right? Like I was a Christian fundamentalist from the standpoint that I had absolute certainty about a certain Christian theology that I would argue tooth and nail over. And in that sense, I was a fundamentalist. But then I just switched sides and became a fundamentalist in a different way, which was, having my absolute certainty and superiority and my combativeness against religion. So religion can be a religion, whether you're for it or against it, like you can make a religion out of either. And so which, as you said, it makes complete sense. Okay, if you've, and take a lot of the cases of people that I work with, if you gave 10, 20, 30, 40 years of your life to religion and it dominated everything in your life, and you discovered that not only is it not true, but it basically determined your trajectory in life in all kinds of ways that you now see are harmful, you're going to be pissed.
Yes. Yes,
you
you
know,
are.
and for a time, I mean, it's likely you're not going to see one shred of, goodness that has anything to do with religion, and your only thought is that I can only hope that religion will be totally eradicated from the face of the earth, and as much as I can help that happen, then I'm all in. So now, and that's completely understandable, during a phase of deconstruction, but then for me, I guess just in my own path, I started discovering, well, there's a few things. First, my particular experience of religion isn't the same as everybody else's. Okay, so that's number one. I mean, there are some people who actually have been part of some religious community or religious tradition that was more accepting, more loving, more, so not everybody had my experience. It wasn't as bad or fundamentalist. I mean, take, for example, if you had gone to a Unitarian Universalist church your own life, like that's a religious community, a religious tradition, a religious experience, but it's not going to be the same in terms of perhaps it. So I realized that. Then I had to realize, well, and I'm also basically believe in the freedom of religion, right? So I can't really go around and insist that religion be completely eradicated from the face of the earth, because if people want to follow religion, then that's their choice to do that. And where I would draw the line, and this what I do, is I tell people I'm not against religion. I'm against the misuse of religion. Now, even though I don't practice religion, I don't come out and say that no other human being can or should, but I do stand up and confront religion where I think that it's doing harm in the world.
Right.
So I think that the shift between, it's almost like, I think part of the goal is to no longer make religion your reference point, either for it or against it. Okay. Find another reference point. And to me, humanism provided that reference point, or it's one reference point that, I mean, it states that it doesn't hold to a belief in the supernatural as a way of defining itself. But other than that, then it sets off on a more positive course to live a meaningful, ethical, fulfilling, productive life, and I think that sometimes you don't want to, it's not a good trade-off for you to switch from years and years and years of a bad religious experience, and then the whole next stage of your life is nothing more than just being angry about it. Like, either way, religion still got you,
Yes, yeah.
So, to come to a different place. That's why I started doing a lot of personal development with people. One, because I realized they didn't have the tools to do that because of what religion did. And because I realized that people would often get stuck in the I'm pissed at religion part of it.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you're describing, it's true in general that in a lot of social media, it's very easy to find people that are mad about something, right? Like that's, whether it's Twitter or Facebook, it's and can be a little more challenging to find groups of people who are learning to cultivate a new way of living their lives, after religion, something a little more than just the vitriol of hating religion.
Yeah. I find that, I have to stop myself from that first reaction, right? There's a famous XKCD cartoon where the character's saying, oh, wait, I'll be there in a minute. Somebody has said something incorrect on the internet. There's this sense that we have, like, somebody said something that's not exactly right. I have to correct them. And no, it's not your job. You don't have to do that.
Yeah.
And
Well,
letting go of that, I think, is actually a huge part. And so the question I
part
want
of it,
to pose to you, go ahead.
well, let me just say real quick, a big part of what I think I do in terms of my social media presence is that I'm not, I am, I will publicly take issue with a lot of things I come across in terms of religious mindsets, and so it's, but it's only a part of how I understand who I am in the world.
Right.
That's one of the things that really attracted me to you, is that my involvement in humanism, I got in the secular community as a whole, I did find that sometimes what's commonly referred to, and usually it's a pejorative reference, is that new atheism, which tends to be the more combative and demeaning sort of approach towards religion. Like for example, it can get pretty bad.
And in fact, a huge premise of why I want to do this podcast is, if you want the hardcore anti-theist, religious people are stupid, you can find that everywhere, right?
Right. Or
what is missing is, if that isn't you, what is there for you? So that is a huge portion of why I want to do this podcast. Is let's talk about, it is a part of the human experience to have that religion is a human invention, and that is somewhat natural, you could say, right? And so we can observe it and talk about it. We can describe our experiences of having been in it and coming out of it. And I love the theists in my life, right? That includes my family, my very, very good friends, college friends. I love these people. Why would I be attacking them? And more importantly, I think there's a perspective of that religious people are stupid somehow. Well, I can't say that. Otherwise, I'd be saying that I was stupid. I'm the same person. I have the exact same intelligence as I did 4 years ago and that I do today. And so it's not about intelligence.
Right.
It's so much more about culture. It's so much more about, what your family was like, all of those things. So.
And all kinds of other underlying factors that would lead to a person being religious, even if they've got a PhD in astrophysics or whatever. Now, to be fair, I will sometimes switch on the religious channel on TV just because, I have to, I don't know, it's some weird form of entertainment or something where I think, do these people still believe this? Or this is actually happening? So, so there are ways that I take on religion, a full frontal sort of confrontation, where I believe that it's being toxic in people's lives. But the reason why I thought you were so important is that when I just seen The Graceful Atheist, I thought, okay, that's someone who's going to create spaces where people can dialogue and converse honestly and vulnerably, but it not have to be a combative environment to explore and talk about, these kinds of things. Because I still think that the greatest defense, the two things Christians and atheists have in common is that the greatest defense for their positions, in my mind, is their morality or their ethics or their goodness. I mean, the reason why we're so upset with Christians is because they're hypocrites. Okay, that's one of the reasons.
Sure.
And so I think it's the same thing with atheists. I mean, if you see an atheist out there being disrespectful, being an asshole, being superior, demeaning and diminishing other people, that's the, that's going to end up being what discredits who they are in the world.
Right. So let me try to segue here. It brings up an interesting point for me. I think the thing that originally attracted me to Jesus, and this happened for me personally in my late teens, was his sense of attacking self-righteousness, right? So
Yeah.
he was going after the people of his day, the religious leaders of his day, who had the form of spirituality or whatever you want to call it, and yet were practicing hypocrisy. Today, I often say that the evangelicals of modern day are really the Pharisees of that time, and I said that when I was a Christian. I say that. But now, as an atheist, I see the exact same kind of mentality in atheism. Right? There are times when it's this certainty that I am absolutely right and you are wrong, and I'm going to correct you. And so the segue is this: so you are a humanist, but you're a humanist who writes about Jesus a fair amount, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you understand Jesus, maybe the New Testament now. Is that something that you still find meaningful at all? And just, I'll let you go.
Yeah, I think that, there's a lot of layers to this. One layer is that did, as a matter of historical fact, was there a Jesus? Okay. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's some disagreement on it, but for the sake of the purpose of this podcast, let's say that it seems to tilt in the direction of the fact that there was a historical individual who we identify as Jesus, who actually lived. Mm-hmm. And after that, we virtually know almost nothing or very little. Okay, so let's just say that. Sure. Just for the sake of this podcast.
Yeah, I don't want to get down into the dark hole of myths right now. So.
Okay, so yes. And so, but then you'd have to say, okay, well, then the only thing we really know about Jesus, mainly, I mean, except for an obscure thing here or there by one or two other church historians, is what it says in the Gospels, which are roughly, at least three of them, roughly about the same story, give and take a little bit, and then John, which is a spiritualized version of it. So, it's the reason why I think that there are times when I feel like that there's not, that we can deal with Jesus, that we don't necessarily have to totally demolish and discredit Jesus, in the sense of, one of the reasons why that you just said is that Jesus seemed to provide a meaningful path of being an individual. He can look at a religious tradition and confront the things about that tradition that are detrimental and affirm the things that are, constructive and good. Jesus was a Jew, and he took on his Judaism that ultimately, got him killed. But he also affirmed it or explained it in more detail, like the Sermon on the Mount. You say, don't murder, I say, don't hate, and so I see then there's the whole religious or these, archetypes that Jung had several, and others have talked about this. So to what extent does Jesus represent something that human beings almost universally, Jesus symbolizes something that human beings universally connect with? Mm-hmm. Is that possible? I wrote a blog post also that was like, I think it was something like 15 ways that Jesus is relevant, regardless of what you believe, whether you're a Christian or an atheist. Here are 15 ways that Jesus is relevant. So, for example, and this even gets into how you want to take the Bible. So you could take the idea of Jesus, this idea of him being some mix between divinity and humanity, which actually historically, I think, kind of got blown into out of proportion in a way that even Jesus would be surprised by. Sure. But as a symbol of self-actualization, for example, a person coming into the full awareness and full expression of who they are, a person who was compelled to stand in solidarity with the victimized, with the marginalized, a person who spoke truth to power, and this, religion, to the political establishment of his day, so in that sense, I see that Jesus can have non-religious, be viewed as meaningful in these ways that don't have anything to do with the religious context. In fact, there's books, I read 2 of them by the same book title, entitled Christianity Without God, which are 2 books that were written by people who spoke of the fact that, like, even the Jesus himself didn't even believe in theism the way that the Christian church has made it into, and that so it's so I see Jesus in that sense. I see Jesus as somebody who represents and symbolizes something that human beings instinctually are inspired to or compelled by. And just like I would see relevance in, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi or, any the Buddha, any number of people that represent something meaningfully for human beings.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've learned, and again, with your education and background, you probably know much better than I do, but is that these questions about how do I find meaning, how do I find happiness, are old, right? You know what I mean? This is not
There's nothing new under the sun.
I haven't come up with one new idea, to add to this conversation, either religiously or from a naturalistic perspective. And that we have been trying as a species to answer these questions since the beginning of time, right? And the Greeks, with this idea of kind of a civic religion, or, with ethics, with what have you, like the Chinese with Confucianism, just this has been around a long time.
and including Jesus, right? I mean, this isn't the first time someone in history was sort of the divine man, savior.
Right.
Once you start poking around, a person comes to realize that the story, the origins of the universe in the Bible aren't exactly unique to the Bible, that the idea of a God-man Messiah who saves the world isn't unique to the Christian belief system. So these are, which is maybe why they represent these archetypes, because they're reoccurring themes, reoccurring people. Now, someone could ask, but why do you think Jesus stuck the way he did? It's hard to avoid the fact that out of all the, billions and billions of human beings that have lived, how is it that Jesus has endured? If you take 2,000 years out of the totality of 200,000, the human beings there's all kinds of reasons why we could talk about that where a person might, could explain that. My view of the Bible is a little, I'm not sure that I'm like, this is something that I would, go to the mat on in terms of my understanding of the Bible.
For sure.
But let me put it this way. I think that this honestly could be giving the Bible more credit than it deserves. And I acknowledge that. I'm not sure it is, but it could be. Mm-hmm. So what I tend to think of the Bible, or maybe I'll put it this way, to me, a high view of the value of the Bible that's a non-traditional kind of Orthodox Christian view would be something like this. The Bible tells a story about humankind's relationship with the transcendent, humankind's relationship, trying to navigate and be in relationship to or with that non-material, transcendent dimension to life that we ascribe the word God to. Mm. And And the value of the Bible is it tells this story of that evolution and relationship. Part of that story is like really bad. Part of that story is people running around and rationalizing, going into parts of the earth and completely exterminating, groups of people, rationalizes somehow that God told me to do this, right? It's part of the story of the Bible. It's still the story, right? People still do this. It happened in crusades. It happened in all kinds of ways where we still commit that error. So no, there is no God that told people to go into some country and wipe out people for his glory. There is no God that told anybody to smash a baby against rocks. There is no God who killed the guy who slipped when he was carrying, the Ark of the Covenant. None of that stuff happened the way that it was explained. It was explained the way it was for a useful purpose, but that's part of the story of humankind's relationship with God, all that kinds of stuff that we do. But the story can also be beautiful.
Yeah.
Like the book of Ruth, like, the, Naomi loses everything, and with no obligation, Ruth gives up about everything to help her.
Right.
And I had Hebrew by Dr. McGarry in seminary, and one of the things that I learned in that Hebrew class is that the Hebrew word, there's a word that's used to describe Ruth, and the only other time the word is used in the Bible is to describe God himself, and it's the word hesed, which means loving kindness.
Yeah.
So, that's a beautiful story. Sometimes we're like that. Sometimes we are willing to come alongside people in their suffering and sacrifice our own comfort and well-being to stand in solidarity with another person and help them. And in those moments, that is the best example of anything that we could point to and refer to as transcendent or ultimate reality or even God.
Yeah.
So I think the Bible is all of that. It's not to be taken, it's a story, and it does put the onus on the individual to have some discernment.
Yes.
About
what are the lessons we're supposed to learn from this? What not to do in many cases, but
right.
Yeah.
Like Paul wrote Paul wrote most of the letters in the New Testament, but you got to understand that Paul is writing letters to churches, answering questions, trying to figure out how does it work to be a Christian in the context of our culture. But it was cultural, it had to work in their culture.
Yeah. Yes.
So, to see women wearing head coverings to church or taking seriously that they can't be pastors or that they need to submit to their men or their spiritual, these are, in my mind, cultural aspects of the evolution of understanding these truths, but they're not sacred.
Right. Well, I think that's the point, right? As a humanist, we can take in the stories of the Bible and derive some value from them, but without being obligated to do the apologetics, right? To make them literal or to make them binding in some way that, so we can find that value in the same way that we can in other historical writings and other.
Yeah.
So I'm cognizant of our time, and I want to give you a chance to just tell the listeners a little bit about your work, how they could reach out to you. You've written 5 books. Maybe briefly tell us about those, and then tell us a little bit about your coaching and how people can engage with you.
Yeah, So I've written 5 books. Divine Nobodies is the book where I share my initial deconstruction of my faith and what were the factors that led to my deciding to leave my ministerial career and my Christianity. And once I started getting letters and noticing that people were getting stuck in the anti-religion kind of mode, I made the decision that I needed to write a follow-up book that was describing my initial attempts of figuring out what it meant for me to live a meaningful life after religion. So my next book, Wide Open Spaces, is a book where I tell the part of the story as I stumbled forward trying to figure out life and meaning outside of religion. My third book is Being Jesus in Nashville, and that book was my so I deconstructed all my Christian theology, except I didn't know quite what to do with Jesus himself. And so I devoted a year of my life to test a theory that I started to have about Jesus, which was there's absolutely no difference between Jesus and me. Okay. And that the claim that Jesus was more than me is not true, and or that I'm more than I think I am. Either way, whatever Jesus was,
Sure.
I am. Okay.
Sure. Okay.
So I spent a year of my life kind of plowing into that, which was it was highly controversial. The publishing house, which I published my first two books, canceled my book contract. They accused me of heresy and said they could not publish the book. So because I wrote my first book contract was written with a Christian publisher, and they were okay with Divine Nobodies. They were getting kind of nervous with Wide Open Spaces, and when Being Jesus came out, it was like, we're done.
No more.
so that was Being Jesus in Nashville. Then the next book after that was Notes from Over the Edge, which was a book about my journey of addressing the root cause of my own suffering, which I was not able to resolve in my previous religious framework. Mm-hmm. And in that book, I also kind of disentangle what it is particularly about Christianity that prevents people from really resolving the root of their own suffering and living a life of fulfillment. And then the very last book I wrote is called Inner Anarchy, which was my last attempt to give a alternative understanding of what Jesus meant outside the Christian religious framework and understanding. Mm-hmm. And I just finished my manuscript of my sixth book, which is How to Have a Great Day Without God. Okay. The subtitle is a non-religious guide to living life well. And that's probably the book that's maybe the more humanist, non-secular discussion of that. So, you can go to Jim Palmer on Amazon. You can find any of those books. I have a website, jimpalmerauthor.com. And like I said, I do a lot of spiritual direction and personal consulting with people who are deconstructing their faith, going through a faith crisis, trying to figure out all this stuff we've talked about on this call.
Right. Yeah.
After religion. I've got a Life After Religion course that you can do, also online, which is walks people through the steps of addressing more the depths of how religious indoctrination and church religious damage, addressing that on a deeper level. And so, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I guess jimpalmerauthor.com. You can find pretty much about anything there. It will give you links to my Amazon or the course or anywhere else I'm on.
Very cool. Okay.
Social media. So yes.
Excellent. That's fantastic. Yeah. And Jim, I've really appreciated this conversation. I felt like we could have done this for 4 more hours. Maybe if you'll consider it some other time, we'll have you back on. It's been a lot of fun. So I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Yeah, I'd be happy to come on anytime. I also appreciate you and who you are for other people in the world. And so, I'm inspired and hopeful knowing that there are people like you that are, taking that approach of being the graceful atheist, creating spaces where people can explore humanism and a secular approach to life that without it just being a complete, like I hate religion parade.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm trying. In fact, I start all my podcast by saying, my name is David and I'm trying to be the graceful atheist because it's aspirational, right? Like I haven't gotten there. I'm figuring it out like everybody else. So, well, Jim, thank you so much. And we will talk to you a bit later.
Okay, thanks. I'll talk to you soon.
Some final thoughts on the episode. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jim Palmer as much as I did. We could have talked for hours. There was so much that I wanted to get into about humanism and Jim's faith transitions from deconstruction to becoming a secular humanist chaplain. I feel like there's lots more on the table there. Maybe we'll have Jim back at some point in time. There'll be lots more to say about humanism in future episodes as well. I do want to point out that Jim is a life coach specifically for people who have deconverted, for those people who have deconstructed their faith and who find themselves in need of someone to be there along the way. So I highly recommend that you get in touch with Jim if you are looking for some support. I'll have links in the show notes for all of Jim's online presence. If you want to get in touch with Jim, you can find his website at jimpalmerauthor.com. I'll also have links to his books on Amazon. In our interview, we do bring up the Clergy Project again. That seems to be a common theme. I'll have links to the Clergy Project. And I also want to bring up just one correction. In my previous episode, we mentioned the Humanist Celebrants and the American Humanist Association. And the American Humanist Association has corrected me to point out that their adjunct organization that endorses celebrants and chaplains is called the Humanist Society. And so I will have links to the Humanist Society for anyone who is interested in exploring becoming a humanist chaplain themselves. I want to thank Jim for coming on the podcast and sharing his considerable insight. And I hope it helps you on your journey of discovery of what it means to be a human being having a human experience. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Micaiah Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me @gracefulatheist. Or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.